Arthur Ellington had spent more than 20 years deciding the fate of other people. He had sentenced violent offenders, ruled against powerful corporations, thrown out cases built on unconstitutional arrests, and on more than one occasion, he had looked directly at a police officer in a federal courtroom and reminded him that a badge was not a shield from the Constitution. But on that warm Saturday morning, none of that seemed important. At least, not yet. The 60-year-old federal judge stood in his driveway, wearing faded jeans, old work gloves, and a dark gray Howard University hoodie that had seen better days. A small bucket sat beside him. Weeds covered part of the flower bed near the front walk. His wife had been asking him to clean it up for weeks. Now, with a rare free weekend and no hearings scheduled until Monday, he had finally decided to do it himself. The neighborhood was quiet. Birds chirped from the oak trees lining the street. A sprinkler hissed somewhere down the block. The kind of peaceful suburban morning people spent years working toward. Arthur enjoyed those mornings. In court, every day involved conflict. Arguments, accusations, people trying to convince him that their version of events was the truth. Out here, pulling weeds from the soil, life felt simple, predictable, normal. He preferred it that way. A black Mercedes-Benz S-Class sat in the driveway behind him. The car looked expensive because it was, but Arthur rarely thought about that. He had purchased it years earlier after receiving a promotion to the federal bench. Most of the time, it simply transported him between home and the courthouse, nothing more. Arthur leaned forward and pulled another cluster of weeds from the ground. A few roots resisted. He smiled. "You're more stubborn than the lawyers I dealt with this week." The comment was directed at nobody, a private joke. Then he heard an engine. A police cruiser rolled slowly down the street. Nothing unusual. Police cars passed through the neighborhood regularly. Arthur barely looked up. The cruiser continued moving, then slowed again. Arthur noticed it stop about 30 yards away. He glanced up briefly. A young officer sat behind the wheel, watching him. Arthur wasn't concerned. He returned to his work. The officer remained parked. 30 seconds passed, then 60, then 2 minutes. Arthur finally stood and stretched his back. The cruiser door opened. The officer stepped out. Tall, mid-30s, athletic build, sunglasses, confident stride. The nameplate on his uniform read, Officer Bradley Higgins. Arthur immediately recognized the walk. Every judge eventually learns to recognize it. It was the walk of someone who had already decided what he believed before asking a single question. Higgins crossed the street and approached the driveway. His hand rested casually near his duty belt. Not unusual, but not necessary either. Arthur waited. Higgins stopped several feet away. His eyes moved from Arthur to the Mercedes, to the house, then back to Arthur. The officer's expression changed slightly, just enough. Most people would have missed it. Arthur didn't. Years in court had taught him to read faces, witnesses, lawyers, defendants, jurors, police officers. The look lasted less than a second, but Arthur recognized it instantly. Suspicion. Not based on evidence, not based on behavior, based on something else. Something much older, much uglier. Still, Arthur remained polite. "Good morning, officer." Higgins didn't return the greeting. Instead, he asked, "Do you live here?" Arthur blinked. Of all the possible openings, that wasn't one he expected. He looked around theatrically. "My understanding is that I do." The officer wasn't amused. "I'm serious." "So am I." Higgins removed his sunglasses. His eyes narrowed. "What's your name?" Arthur calmly set down his gardening tool. May I ask why you're asking? The officer glanced toward the Mercedes again, then toward the house, then back at Arthur. A long pause followed. Arthur could practically see the assumptions forming inside the man's head. The hoodie, the gloves, the expensive property, the luxury car, and the black man standing beside them. Finally, Higgins spoke. We received reports of suspicious activity in the area. Arthur looked up and down the empty street. No kidding. Several residents reported someone walking around properties. Arthur raised an eyebrow. I've been in this driveway for nearly an hour. That's not what I asked. Arthur nodded slowly. There it was, the shift. The conversation wasn't about gathering information. It was about validating a conclusion already reached. And that was never a good sign. Not in a courtroom, not on a street corner, and certainly not in someone's own driveway. The judge folded his arms. Officer, are you suggesting I'm engaged in criminal activity? I'm asking questions. Then ask specific ones. For a moment, Higgins looked irritated. People usually didn't respond this way. Most citizens became nervous when confronted by police. They apologized, explained themselves, attempted to prove innocence. Arthur did none of those things. His calmness seemed to bother the officer. A lot. Higgins took a step closer. Let's start simple. Identification. Arthur's expression remained unchanged. Do you have reasonable suspicion that I've committed a crime? The question hit like a brick, not because it was aggressive, because it was precise, very precise, and Higgins immediately noticed. His jaw tightened. Just show me your ID. Am I legally required to? Why are you making this difficult? Arthur almost smiled. The irony was remarkable. The man standing on his own property had become the difficult one, not the officer interrogating him without evidence, not the officer who couldn't explain what crime was being investigated. No. The difficult person was the citizen asking questions. Arthur had seen this pattern before, hundreds of times, maybe thousands, usually from the bench. Today he was experiencing it firsthand, and he didn't like where it was heading. Across the street, a curtain moved. Someone was watching, then another. Neighbors were noticing. Arthur sighed internally. This situation should have ended 3 minutes ago. Instead, it was escalating. And Officer Higgins seemed completely unaware of how dangerous that could become. Not for Arthur, for himself. Because every additional decision he made was creating a record. Every statement, every order, every assumption, every action. And if Higgins continued down this path, that record was eventually going to land on the desk of someone who understood the law far better than he did. Arthur looked directly into the officer's eyes. For the first time, his voice carried a subtle edge. Not anger, authority, the kind developed over decades. Officer Higgins. The officer froze. Arthur had read his name tag. Before this conversation goes any further, I'd like to know exactly why you're detaining me. The word detaining changed everything, because now the legal questions became unavoidable, and for the first time since stepping out of his cruiser, Officer Bradley Higgins realized this wasn't going to be the easy encounter he thought it would be. The problem was that he still had no idea who Arthur Ellington really was, and that ignorance was about to cost him far more than a bad morning. Officer Higgins stared at Arthur for several seconds. Most people changed their tone when police became involved. Some became nervous, others became defensive, a few became angry. But this man standing in front of him seemed completely unaffected. That bothered Higgins more than he cared to admit, because confidence like that usually came from one of two places. Either the person had something to hide, or they knew something Higgins didn't. And Higgins wasn't interested in considering the second possibility. Nobody said you're being detained, he replied. Arthur nodded slowly. Then I'm free to go back to my gardening? The officer hesitated, just for a moment, then said, no. Arthur looked at him. So I'm not free to leave? No. Then I'm being detained. The silence that followed felt heavier than it should have. Higgins shifted his weight. His irritation was becoming visible now. Arthur could see it. The officer had expected compliance. Instead, he was being forced into a legal conversation he clearly wasn't prepared to have. "Look," Higgins said, "I'm trying to figure out what's going on here." Arthur glanced around his property. "The flowers are overgrown." "What?" "The thing that's going on here." Arthur pointed at the flower bed. "I'm removing weeds." The officer's jaw tightened. Across the street, another front door opened. A middle-aged woman stepped outside carrying a coffee mug. She immediately noticed the police cruiser, then Arthur, then the conversation. Her expression changed. People in affluent neighborhoods develop a sixth sense for unusual activity. This definitely qualified. Higgins followed her gaze briefly before turning back. "Let's stop playing games." "I'm not playing games." "Then identify yourself." Arthur folded his arms. "Under what authority?" Higgins took another step forward. The distance between them was shrinking. The tension was growing. "You know," the officer said, "most innocent people don't make simple interactions this difficult." Arthur nearly laughed. He had heard versions of that statement for decades, in police reports, court testimony, internal affairs investigations. It was one of those phrases officers used when evidence was weak, a shortcut, an attempt to make constitutional rights sound suspicious. Arthur looked directly at him. "And most professional officers can explain the legal basis for their actions." For the first time, genuine anger flashed across Higgins's face. Not explosive anger, wounded pride, the dangerous kind. The kind that appears when authority is questioned publicly, especially in front of witnesses. And witnesses were beginning to appear. The woman across the street had stopped pretending to check her mail. Now she was openly watching. A gardener down the block had paused his work. Another neighbor stepped onto a porch. 3 observers, then 4, then 5. Nothing spreads faster in a quiet neighborhood than a police confrontation, Higgins noticed. And suddenly, he felt pressure. Pressure to assert control. Pressure to avoid looking weak. Pressure to win. The moment an officer begins thinking about winning, Arthur knew, good judgment often disappears. "Last chance," Higgins said. Arthur's eyebrows rose slightly. "Last chance for what? Show me identification." "No." The answer arrived instantly, calmly, without hesitation, without fear. The officer blinked. He clearly wasn't accustomed to hearing that word, especially not from someone standing alone, especially not from a black man in an expensive neighborhood. Arthur could practically hear the gears turning inside Higgins's head. This wasn't how the script was supposed to go, at all. The officer took a breath, then another. His patience was evaporating. "What exactly is your problem?" Arthur looked genuinely puzzled. "My problem?" "Yeah." Arthur gestured toward the driveway. "I was gardening." Then he pointed toward Higgins. "You arrived." Several neighbors exchanged glances. One of them struggled to hide a smile. Higgins saw it. His face reddened immediately. Humiliation had entered the equation, and humiliation often produces bad decisions. Very bad decisions. The officer's radio crackled. A dispatcher relayed routine traffic. Neither man paid attention. Their focus remained locked on each other. Arthur studied Higgins carefully. The officer was young, not incompetent, not unintelligent, just reckless, driven more by ego than evidence. Arthur had encountered many people like him over the years: lawyers, executives, politicians, police officers. The pattern was always the same. When reality challenged their assumptions, they doubled down instead of reevaluating. And Higgins was doubling down, fast. "Let me ask you something," Arthur said. The officer didn't answer. "If I were a white man standing in this driveway, would we be having this conversation?" The question landed like a hammer. Several neighbors visibly froze. No one spoke. The entire street seemed to become quiet. Higgins stared at him. For the first time since arriving, uncertainty appeared in his eyes. Only briefly, but it was there. Then came anger, stronger than before, much stronger. Don't do that. Do what? You know exactly what. Arthur held his gaze. No, explain it. Higgins looked away first. A mistake, small, but revealing. The officer suddenly felt surrounded. Every neighbor watching, every window observing, every second making him look worse. And then the thing happened that transformed a questionable stop into a career-ending incident. A silver SUV pulled into a nearby driveway. An elderly woman stepped out. Arthur immediately recognized her. Mrs. Eleanor Grant, 74 years old, retired school principal, lived next door for nearly 15 years. She spotted Arthur instantly, then noticed the officer, then noticed the tension. And unlike the others, she didn't stay back. She marched directly toward them, fast, purposefully, fearlessly. Arthur? Her voice carried across the street. The judge turned. Morning, Eleanor. She stopped several feet away. What on earth is happening? Before Arthur could answer, Higgins spoke. Ma'am, this is police business. Eleanor frowned. Police business? She pointed toward Arthur. I've known this man for 15 years. Higgins didn't respond. She continued. That's his house. Silence. That's his car. More silence. And unless something changed overnight, he's been living here longer than most of the people on this street. The neighbors began murmuring. Arthur saw Higgins's posture stiffen immediately. The officer had just been handed information that should have ended the encounter. A reasonable officer would have reassessed, asked a few questions, verified ownership, moved on. Instead, Higgins did something else, something far worse. He dismissed her, completely. Ma'am, I didn't ask for your opinion. The neighborhood fell silent. Arthur slowly closed his eyes for a second, because he recognized what was happening. The officer had reached a point where saving face mattered more than finding the truth. And once an authority figure reaches that stage, the situation usually gets much worse before it gets better. Eleanor stared at Higgins in disbelief. I'm trying to help you. I don't need help. Arthur opened his eyes. And for the first time that morning, he felt genuine concern. Not for himself, for Officer Bradley Higgins. Because the man had just ignored a witness, dismissed exculpatory information, escalated without evidence, and done it all in front of multiple observers. The record was growing. Every minute, every word, every decision. And Higgins still hadn't realized that the most damaging part of this entire encounter wasn't what he had already done. It was what he was about to do next. Officer Higgins stood perfectly still. For a few seconds, nobody spoke. Not Arthur, not Eleanor, not the neighbors gathering along the sidewalks. The entire street seemed to be waiting for the officer to make a choice. He could end the encounter, walk back to his cruiser, leave with nothing more than a bruised ego. Or he could keep pushing. Arthur already knew which option Higgins would choose. People rarely reverse course once pride becomes involved, especially when they have an audience. And Higgins now had an audience. A large one. The officer looked around the street. Everywhere he turned, someone was watching. Some openly, others through windows. A few had already pulled out their phones. That should have made him cautious. Instead, it made him defensive. And defensive people often make reckless decisions. Higgins pointed directly at Arthur. You know what? I've had enough. Arthur's expression didn't change. Of what? The attitude. Several neighbors exchanged looks. The attitude? Not trespassing, not burglary, not vandalism, not suspicious behavior. Attitude. Even Higgins seemed to realize how weak that sounded. His face tightened immediately. He tried again. "You're refusing to cooperate with a lawful investigation." Arthur remained calm. "What investigation?" The officer ignored the question. Instead, he stepped forward, close enough that Arthur could smell coffee on his breath. "Turn around." The street fell silent. Arthur stared at him. "Excuse me?" "You heard me." "No," Arthur said evenly. "I heard words. I just want to make sure I understood them correctly." Higgins pointed toward the Mercedes. "Turn around and place your hands on the vehicle." A collective gasp moved through the neighborhood. Eleanor looked horrified. "Officer, are you serious?" "Stay out of it, ma'am." Arthur looked directly into Higgins's eyes. His voice remained calm, almost disappointingly calm. "On what grounds?" "Obstruction." The judge blinked. For the first time all morning, genuine disbelief crossed his face. Not because he was scared, because the answer was absurd. "Obstruction of what, exactly?" "You are interfering with an investigation." Arthur slowly shook his head. "No, I'm asking questions." "Same thing." Several neighbors immediately began recording. Arthur noticed. So did Higgins. Neither acknowledged it. The officer was too committed now, too invested, too determined to prove that he was in control. And Arthur understood something important. This was no longer about law enforcement. This was about ego, the most dangerous kind of encounter. Because evidence no longer mattered. Facts no longer mattered. Only authority mattered. And Higgins felt his authority slipping away. Arthur took a slow breath, then spoke carefully. "Officer Higgins." The officer didn't answer. "I'm advising you not to do this." A strange sentence, not a threat, not a warning, not even a challenge, just advice. But Higgins heard it differently. He heard defiance, disrespect, resistance, and that made everything worse. "You don't get to advise me." Arthur sighed. "I think you'll eventually wish I had." The words hung in the air. Several neighbors glanced at one another. Something about the statement felt unusual, like there was information missing, a piece of the puzzle nobody could see. Even Eleanor looked confused. Only Arthur understood exactly what he meant. Higgins didn't, and that ignorance was becoming expensive. Very expensive. The officer grabbed Arthur's left arm, hard. The reaction from the crowd was immediate. "What are you doing? Hey, he's not resisting." Phones lifted higher, more cameras, more witnesses. Arthur didn't pull away, didn't tense up, didn't resist. He simply looked down at the officer's hand, then back up. "Officer Higgins." The officer tightened his grip. "Turn around." Arthur remained motionless. "Am I under arrest?" "No." "Then am I free to leave?" "No." Arthur nodded once. Understood. That single word somehow irritated Higgins more than anything else had, because Arthur sounded composed, controlled, like a professor documenting a lecture, not a man being manhandled by police. And Higgins desperately wanted a different reaction. Fear, anger, resistance, anything. Instead, he got calm observation, the kind that made every mistake impossible to ignore. The officer yanked Arthur toward the Mercedes. Several neighbors shouted simultaneously. Eleanor stepped forward. "Stop!" Higgins immediately pointed at her. "Stay back." She froze, not because she was afraid, because she realized things were spiraling. Fast. Arthur stumbled slightly as he was pulled toward the vehicle, not from resistance, from surprise. At 60 years old, he wasn't expecting to be shoved across his own driveway. Yet he still didn't fight back, didn't argue, didn't raise his voice. That unnerved Higgins even more. The officer spun him around, forced him against the side of the Mercedes. The expensive black paint reflected the entire scene like a mirror. Neighbors, phones, police cruiser, everything. Arthur felt the cool metal against his chest, and for the first time all morning, anger appeared. Not externally, internally. A quiet anger. The kind that forms when someone knowingly abuses power. He had spent years hearing testimony about incidents like this, years reviewing body camera footage, years listening to officers explain why escalation had been necessary. Now he was living it himself. The experience felt strangely surreal. Hands behind your back. Arthur complied, not because Higgins had earned obedience, but because resisting would only make the situation worse. The officer pulled out handcuffs. The metallic click echoed across the driveway. One cuff, then the other, locked, tight. A woman across the street covered her mouth. Someone else muttered, "Oh my God." Eleanor looked ready to cry. Arthur stood silently, handcuffed, on his own property, in front of his own house, for no crime whatsoever. And still, he remained calm. That calmness finally began unsettling the neighbors, because most people would be furious. Most people would scream, demand answers, threaten lawsuits. Arthur did none of those things. Instead, he slowly turned his head toward Eleanor. "Please step back." Her eyes widened. "What?" "Go back to the sidewalk." "Arthur." "Please." His voice was gentle, firm, measured. The same tone he used in court. The same tone that made attorneys stop talking mid-sentence. Eleanor reluctantly obeyed. Arthur then looked toward the nearest neighbor holding a phone, a younger man named Kevin. "Make sure you're recording." The street went completely silent. Even Higgins froze. For the first time all morning, uncertainty flickered across his face. Just briefly, but Arthur saw it. So did everyone else. Because innocent people usually begged for the camera to stop. They didn't ask for more recording. Arthur did. And suddenly several neighbors began filming simultaneously. One phone became 3, then 5, then 7. Every angle, every statement, every action, preserved. The officer swallowed. A tiny movement, almost invisible, but Arthur noticed. Because something had finally changed. For the first time since arriving, Higgins wasn't entirely sure he was right. The problem was that realization had arrived too late. Much too late. The handcuffs were already on. The witnesses were already present. The recordings were already running. And the chain of consequences had already begun. What nobody on that street knew yet was that within the next hour, a senior police supervisor would arrive. And the moment he saw who was sitting in handcuffs on that curb, everything would change. The handcuffs had been on Arthur Ellington's wrists for nearly 8 minutes. 8 long minutes. Long enough for neighbors to gather. Long enough for multiple videos to begin circulating through neighborhood group chats. Long enough for Officer Higgins to convince himself that he had done the right thing. That was perhaps the most dangerous part. The longer someone commits to a mistake, the harder it becomes to admit it. Higgins had crossed that line several minutes ago. Now he stood beside the curb, arms folded, trying to project confidence, trying to look like a police officer in control of a situation. The effort wasn't entirely successful. Arthur sat calmly on the edge of the sidewalk. His hands remained cuffed behind his back. His posture was relaxed, almost annoyingly relaxed. No shouting, no threats, no panic, just patience. The kind of patience that comes from knowing time is on your side. That composure was beginning to bother Higgins, a lot. Most people became increasingly emotional in handcuffs. Arthur seemed to become calmer with every passing minute, as if you were waiting for something or someone. The officer's radio crackled. Unit 24, status check. Higgins immediately grabbed the microphone. Everything's under control. Arthur almost smiled. That sentence had appeared in countless reports he'd reviewed over the years. Everything's under control. Sometimes it was true. Often it wasn't. This was one of those times. A police SUV appeared at the far end of the street. Several neighbors noticed it immediately. More importantly, so did Higgins. Relief flashed across his face. Backup. Validation. Someone who would support his decisions. Someone who would confirm that he had handled everything correctly. At least, that's what he expected. The SUV turned the corner and stopped behind the cruiser. The driver's door opened. A broad-shouldered man stepped out, gray hair, weathered face, calm eyes. The kind of eyes that had seen nearly everything. Sergeant Thomas Miller, 23 years on the force, respected by officers, known throughout the department. The sort of supervisor who could determine whether a young officer's career advanced or stalled. Higgins straightened immediately. Arthur noticed. Interesting. The officer respected this man, or feared him, possibly both. Miller walked toward the scene without rushing. His eyes moved carefully from one detail to another. The crowd, the phones, the neighbors, Arthur sitting in handcuffs, Officer Higgins standing nearby. Nothing escaped his attention. Years of experience had trained him to evaluate situations before speaking. That habit had saved him countless times. It would save him again today. Eventually. But not immediately. "What's going on?" Miller asked. Higgins answered quickly. Too quickly. The way people often do when they want to control a narrative before anyone else can speak. Suspicious subject. Arthur remained silent. Refused identification. Still silent. Interfered with an investigation. Silent. Multiple lawful commands ignored. Arthur continued watching. Miller nodded slowly, not agreeing, simply listening. A distinction Higgins failed to notice. The sergeant looked toward Arthur. "Sir, what's your side of the story?" Before Arthur could answer, Higgins interrupted. "He's been argumentative from the beginning." Miller's eyes shifted toward him. The look lasted less than a second, yet Higgins immediately stopped talking. Interesting, Arthur thought. Very interesting. The sergeant wasn't impressed. Arthur finally spoke. His voice remained calm, measured, controlled. "Good morning, Sergeant." "Morning." Arthur gestured slightly with his cuffed hands. "As you can see, your officer and I have had a disagreement." Several neighbors laughed quietly. Even Miller fought back the hint of a smile. Higgins didn't. The officer looked furious. Arthur continued. "I was gardening." Miller nodded. "I live here." Another nod. "I declined to provide identification because no lawful basis was provided." The sergeant remained expressionless. Arthur looked directly at him. "Then I was handcuffed." Simple, concise, no exaggeration, no emotion, just facts. Experienced investigators often pay attention when someone tells a story that way. Facts are difficult to attack. Emotions are easy. Miller folded his arms, then turned toward Higgins. "What was the original call?" The officer hesitated. A very small hesitation, but Arthur noticed. So did Miller. "Suspicious activity." "What activity?" Another pause. "Caller reported someone near residences." Miller frowned. "Near residences?" "Yes." The sergeant looked around. Arthur's house sat directly behind them. The flower bed, the bucket, the gardening tools, the weeds. Everything supported Arthur's explanation. Everything. Miller's expression changed slightly. Not much, just enough. The first crack had appeared, but Higgins missed it, because he was still trying to justify his actions, still trying to prove he was right, still fighting the battle he had already lost. Eleanor stepped forward from the crowd. "Sergeant?" Miller turned. "Yes, ma'am. I've known Arthur for 15 years. Higgins immediately groaned. "Eleanor, stay out of this." The sergeant's head snapped toward Higgins. The temperature of the entire scene changed instantly, not dramatically, subtly. But everyone felt it, including Arthur. Because for the first time that morning, Officer Higgins had interrupted the wrong person. Miller's voice became colder. "Did I ask you to speak?" The officer froze. "No, Sergeant." "Then don't." Silence. A heavy one. The crowd noticed. Arthur noticed. Most importantly, Higgins noticed. For the first time all morning, his confidence wavered. Just slightly. Eleanor continued. "Arthur owns this house." Miller listened. "He's lived here for years." Another nod. "Everyone on this street knows him." More silence. Then the sergeant asked a simple question. One question. A question that should have been asked an hour ago. "Did you verify ownership of the property?" The world seemed to stop. Arthur looked toward Higgins. The neighbors looked toward Higgins. Even Eleanor looked toward Higgins. The officer swallowed. Hard. No. The answer hit the street like a gunshot, because everyone immediately understood what it meant. No verification, no confirmation, no investigation, just assumptions. Miller stared at him. The sergeant's face revealed nothing, which somehow made the moment worse. "Did you run the address?" "No." "Property records?" "No." "Vehicle registration?" "No." Each answer sounded weaker than the last. Each answer stripped away another layer of justification. Each answer pushed Higgins closer to disaster. Arthur said nothing. He didn't need to. The officer was dismantling his own defense, one answer at a time. The sergeant looked toward the Mercedes, then toward the house, then back toward Arthur. A thought was beginning to form. Not a conclusion, just a possibility. And once that possibility entered his mind, he couldn't ignore it. Something about this situation didn't make sense. Not at all. The calmness, the confidence, the precision of Arthur's language, the complete absence of fear, the way he spoke about legal standards, the way he carried himself. None of it fit Higgins's version of events. None of it. Miller looked directly at Arthur. "Sir." Arthur met his gaze. "Yes, Sergeant?" For the first time since arriving, Miller asked the question that would change everything. "What exactly do you do for a living?" Arthur looked at him for a moment, then smiled slightly. Not because the answer was funny, because he knew what was about to happen next. And because Officer Bradley Higgins still had absolutely no idea. Arthur opened his mouth, and the entire future of this encounter shifted. Sergeant Miller held Arthur's gaze. The entire street seemed to go quiet. Even the distant sounds of lawnmowers and sprinklers faded into the background. "What exactly do you do for a living?" Miller repeated. Arthur sat calmly on the curb, handcuffed, dust on his jeans, gardening gloves still hanging from one hand. To anyone passing by, he looked like an ordinary homeowner. Nothing more, nothing special. Certainly not someone capable of changing the course of several careers with a single sentence. Arthur glanced briefly at Officer Higgins. The young officer stood rigidly beside the cruiser, still convinced he could somehow explain his way out of this. Still convinced the situation wasn't as bad as it looked. Arthur almost felt sorry for him. Almost. Then he answered, "I'm a federal judge." Silence. Nobody moved. Nobody spoke. For a moment, the words simply hung in the air. Higgins frowned, as if he hadn't heard correctly. "A what?" Arthur looked directly at him. A United States District Court judge. The officer stared, then laughed. Actually laughed. A short, nervous laugh, because his brain rejected the possibility instantly. There was no way, no chance. Not this man. Not the guy in the old hoodie. Not the man pulling weeds in a driveway. Not the person sitting in handcuffs. But Sergeant Miller wasn't laughing, not even slightly. Instead, something changed in his expression. A subtle shift. Recognition. Not certainty. Recognition. Because the name suddenly connected with a memory. A courtroom. A newspaper article. A departmental training seminar years earlier. Miller's face slowly drained of color. "What did you say your name was?" Arthur answered calmly. "Arthur Ellington." The reaction was immediate. The sergeant froze, completely froze. And in that instant, Officer Higgins finally understood that something was very wrong. Very, very wrong. Miller took a step backward, then another. His eyes remained locked on Arthur. "No." The word escaped before he could stop it. One of the neighbors looked confused. Eleanor didn't. She already knew. Several residents suddenly exchanged shocked glances. The name was familiar. Some had seen it on television. Others had read it in newspapers. A few remembered major federal cases. And then it clicked. The entire street realized it almost simultaneously. Officer Higgins was the last one to understand. Miller turned toward him. The expression on the sergeant's face was unlike anything Higgins had ever seen. Not anger, not frustration, pure disbelief. "What did you do?" The question landed like a hammer. Higgins blinked. "Sergeant, What did you do?" Louder this time. The officer's confidence evaporated instantly. "I didn't ask what you thought." Silence. Miller pointed at Arthur. "Do you have any idea who that is?" Higgins looked from the sergeant to Arthur, back to the sergeant, then back again. For the first time all morning, fear appeared in his eyes. Real fear. The kind that comes when a person finally sees the consequences rushing toward them. Miller walked directly to Arthur. His voice completely changed. "Your Honor." Several neighbors gasped. The title confirmed everything. Arthur simply nodded. The sergeant looked sick. Genuinely sick. "I'm so sorry." Arthur remained calm. "Are you?" Miller closed his eyes briefly. That answer hurt, because it wasn't emotional. It was honest. The sergeant immediately knelt beside Arthur and pulled out the handcuff key. The metal clicked. One cuff opened, then the other. For the first time in nearly 20 minutes, Arthur was free. The judge slowly stood, rubbing his wrists. The marks were already visible. Red, angry. Permanent evidence that this had happened. Miller stared at them, then turned toward Higgins. The young officer looked like he was about to be sick. "Badge." The word came quietly. Higgins blinked. "What?" "Your badge." "Sergeant, now." The officer didn't move. Miller's voice hardened. "Do not make me repeat myself." The street watched in complete silence. Arthur watched too, not with satisfaction, not with anger, just observation, the same way he watched witnesses in court. Higgins slowly reached toward his chest. His hands trembled. The badge came off first, then his radio, then his firearm. Each item felt heavier than the last. Miller accepted them without a word. The symbolism wasn't lost on anyone, especially Higgins. His career wasn't officially over, not yet, but he already knew. The ending had begun. Arthur looked at him. For several seconds, neither man spoke. Finally, Higgins found his voice. "I didn't know." Arthur nodded. I know. The answer surprised him. It wasn't hostile. It wasn't triumphant. It was worse. Because it was true. Higgins genuinely hadn't known. But that wasn't the problem. Arthur stepped forward. The question isn't why you treated a federal judge this way. The officer stared. Arthur continued. The question is why you believed it was acceptable to treat anyone this way. The neighborhood became completely silent. Nobody moved. Nobody interrupted. Because everyone understood the difference. If the outcome only changed because the victim happened to be important, then the real problem remained. Arthur looked around the street, at the neighbors, at the phones still recording, at the officers, then back at Higgins. You never checked who I was. Silence. You never verified ownership. Silence. You never investigated a crime. Silence. You made a decision the moment you saw me. The officer lowered his head. Arthur didn't raise his voice, didn't insult him, didn't humiliate him. That somehow made every word hit harder. Because they were facts. Nothing more, nothing less. A black man standing beside an expensive house. That had been enough, and everyone knew it, including Higgins. A second patrol vehicle arrived, then another. Word had spread. Supervisors were already responding. Internal affairs would follow, then lawyers, then reporters, then investigators. The machine had started moving, and it wasn't going to stop. Arthur looked toward Sergeant Miller. I'll be filing a formal complaint. Miller nodded immediately. I understand. I'll also be requesting review of every prior racial profiling allegation involving this officer. Another nod. I understand. Higgins closed his eyes. The reality was finally settling in. Not just what he had done, but what would happen next. The investigation, the hearings, the scrutiny, the questions he wouldn't be able to answer. Arthur turned toward his house. The same house where this entire incident should have ended before it began. He took several steps, then stopped. Without looking back, he said one final thing, something that every person on that street would remember for years. Authority is tested when dealing with powerful people. He paused, then continued. Character is revealed when dealing with people you believe have no power at all. No one spoke. No one could. Because everyone knew exactly what he meant. Arthur walked toward his front door. The crowd slowly parted. The neighbors watched in silence. And behind him, standing in the middle of the street, Officer Bradley Higgins finally understood the mistake that had destroyed his future. It wasn't putting handcuffs on a federal judge. It was believing that the man deserved them before he knew who he was. And that was a mistake no badge could protect him from. The end.